Hey everyone, my name is Kaltenbach, and I am so happy to be here with you today. My wife Amy is here as well, and we're just very thankful to your leadership team and your staff team for having us out here. We've had a lot of great conversations and really appreciate the people that we've met so far. Hope that we get to meet some of you later on. But this is an exciting place, and if you're new here, like if somebody said, if you come to church with me, then I'm going to buy you breakfast afterwards. If you were bribed to get here and it's your first time, it's my first time too, so we can be first timers together. And if you're just checking out this church and you're just kind of kicking the tires, checking underneath the hood, seeing if this is a place where you want to park, I'm certainly glad that you're here. And I hope that you'll keep on coming throughout the month of December and experience Christmas here at Venture Christian Church, because this is a great group of people, and I think that God has exciting plans here, and this is really a place where it's okay not to be okay, but we keep journeying towards God together. So I'm really, really excited to be with you. I got to tell you, and I don't know if I should do this as a pastor or not. This might bring me down a couple notches in your book. If it does, and you get to know me a little bit more, there'll probably be other things to do too. But I'm not overly excited to talk about the subject that they gave me today. I got to be honest, okay? I'm not saying that it's the right thing to do, definitely, but I'm not excited about it. It's not something that really gets me all pumped up and I want to have big conversations about, but it's something that I think is going to help you regardless if you identify as a Christian or not. If it's been a while since you've been in church, or if you've just recently been coming back, if you just thought you check out a service, this is going to be a subject that I think will help us no matter where you are in the spectrum of your spiritual walk with God. I think that this subject is going to help you, but it's a subject I guarantee you that nobody in here really will get that excited about. I mean, doing yourself. You want other people to be this way with you, but when it comes to you, you don't want to be this way with other people. And to kind of introduce what I'm talking about today, we're nearing the end of our series we've been in called The Human Element. And we've been looking at some specific attributes called the fruit of the Spirit. And these attributes are supposed to come out of people when they end up following God, when they end up becoming Jesus followers. These are things that you and I should naturally do on a regular basis. And we've been going through them, and there's this guy who wrote this fantastic letter in the New Testament. His name is Paul, and he wrote about, this is what it looks like if you follow God, because we are naturally drawn to ourselves. We are naturally selfish people. We naturally look out for number one. But Paul says, when you have a relationship with Jesus Christ, and when this relationship is growing, these are the elements that will come out of that relationship. And we find these in Galatians chapter 5, beginning with verse 22. Paul says, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And we should have the words on the screen just right here in a second. But what I'm talking to you today about is this word, gentleness. I got to be honest, I don't want to talk about it today. You see, I want other people to be gentle with me, and maybe you can relate with that. But when other people cross me, you look out, right? Because you obviously have a motive. You obviously have an agenda. I mean, we don't like gentleness. I mean, gentleness is not really a big virtue within our society, is it? It's not a big virtue. It's not a big ethic within our society. It's not something that's really valued. Even in movies, gentleness is not valued. Like one of my favorite heroes of all time is on the screen right here. His name is Indiana Jones. And when I think about Indiana Jones, I think of anything but gentle, right? Did you see the ending of Raiders of the Lost Ark? Did you see what happened to people in the Last Crusade? I mean, not gentle. And recently I went to go see this new movie called Thor Ragnarok. And I think about Thor, and this guy's awesome. And he saves the world, and he adds value to people's lives by defeating the bad guys, but he's not gentle. So I want to be strong like Thor, but he's not gentle. Or maybe you're looking forward to the new Avengers movies, and there's this guy named Black Panther that made this big appearance, not gentle. Or maybe you love history, especially Roman history. I'm a big history buff. I love Roman history. And one of my heroes is Maximus. Anybody else you relate with Maximus? I mean, I used to have his whole speech memorized when he turned around and looked at the emperor. He said, I am husband of a murdered wife, and I can't say it anymore. But I used to have that whole thing memorized, and I was just like, yeah, Maximus, get him. He's making a difference. But yet, not gentle, right? Not a single point. I mean, we really don't want to be gentle. Let me ask you something. When somebody cuts you off in traffic on the 15 freeway, are you gentle in your response when you're all by yourself in the car? I mean, come on, this is church. Tell the truth, shame the devil. I'm not. I'm not gentle. Okay, when I'm standing in line at Target, wanting to check out, and I'm standing in line, and then all of a sudden, somebody just randomly cuts in front of me, or I've been grocery shopping, somebody cuts in front of me, and they only have like 1 or 2 items, I'm still like, not so much of a gentle response. I made a mistake. Actually, it's not really a mistake. It was something that I said I wouldn't do in a while. I went out on Black Friday, you know. There was a group of us that decided to go out together, and the only reason why I went is because they said we won't be going to Walmart, because there's always a fatality every Black Friday at Walmart, right? And so we went to these different locations. We actually got some really good deals. But there was one Lego set over here in Toys R Us that was left, one Star Wars Lego set, and there's these 2 moms, and they were fighting over it. And this one mom had gotten it. This other mom came running up to her and said, I saw it first, so it's mine. And I'm thinking, pretty sure not. Pretty sure she took it first, finders keepers, right? And they're literally like trying to take it from each other. And I'm thinking, do I step in and do something? But then I think, you never know who has a gun nowadays. And look at this face. This is the face of somebody that would immediately be a fatality. So I'm going to let the 2 moms duke it out. They were not gentle over the Lego set. We really don't want to be gentle. I mean, do you want to be gentle when somebody goes around your back spreading lies about you? Is that when you want to be gentle? Do you want to be gentle with a person at work that undercut you to get your position? Do you want to be gentle with that one neighbor you thought was just your BFF, and then she invites everybody else to the party and you don't get invited? And you think to yourself, man, there is something wrong with Shelley. I don't know that I really want to be gentle and respond that way in this situation. And yet what Paul says, and what we're going to see in a minute, even Jesus says, that gentleness is an attribute. Gentleness is something we have to work at, but it's something through the fruit of the Spirit that God has offered to partner with us in as we grow within it. And so I think some of it might be our misunderstanding of what the word gentleness means. In the original Greek language, gentleness doesn't really mean weakness, because I think within our society, we think to ourselves that gentleness is associated with weakness, that if you're gentle, that automatically means that you're weak. And that's just not the case. You see, English is just kind of a boring language. But when you go back to first century Greek, and when you go back to the Old Testament biblical Hebrew, one word can just paint an entire picture. Just one word. And this word gentleness paints a picture of a ferocious animal, something like a ferocious bear or a wolf or just a ferocious dog that is naturally strong, that could naturally just end your life in a heartbeat if they wanted to, but yet the wolf or the bear or the dog has been tamed. It's learned how to kind of withdraw and control its strength. And that's really what gentleness means. Gentleness means strength under control in the face of opposition. As a matter of fact, here's what I would say. You can't be described as being gentle without being strong. If you're not strong, you can't be described as being gentle. You can just be described as weak. But if you're strong, and if you have influence, and if you have strength, and if you have power, and if you have the opportunity to wreck somebody through your words or how you treat them, and you might have every opportunity and every right to do so, but you choose not to, that's what we call gentleness. And so when the Apostle Paul says that you need to display this attribute of gentleness, he says, because you're really strong, and you could make somebody's life miserable, and they might deserve it. But you choose to be gentle. Now, you understand why I don't like gentleness. Because when somebody's standing in opposition to me, what do I want to do? I want to stand in opposition to them. But yet I value what Paul says. And I value what God says through his scriptures. I mean, I look at this book right here. I believe that every single word of this book is true. There's not one false piece not one false word within this book. Actually, it would be better described as a library, a collection of books and letters and stories and narratives and poetry and prophecy and teachings. There's not one error. And so if I follow God, if I'm a Jesus follower, if I want to deepen and develop my intimacy with God, I have got to own this principle of gentleness. And how do we do it, right? That's the case because, man, when you're at work and you have to get to work and somebody just keeps talking to you and you can't figure out how to chew your way out of that bear trap, I mean, you just want to go off and just get out of that conversation, but yet you feel your emotions just kind of rising up and your feelings. How do we control that? How in the world are we able to be gentle when people are opposing us, when we're facing obstacles, when we're facing the overwhelming circumstances of life that can take us down? How do we develop this attribute of gentleness? What I want us to do, we're going to have the words on the screen in just a moment, not yet, but in just a moment, I want us to turn to the book of Matthew. It's the very first book of the New Testament. If you have your Bibles or your mobile devices, you can go ahead and turn there. And let me just tell you about Matthew. Matthew is one of my favorite Gospels. And gospel literally is good news. It's a collection of the sayings of Jesus and the stories about Jesus. And one of the reasons why I love Matthew is the same reason why I love the Gospel of John. Because Matthew and John were both eyewitnesses to everything that Jesus said and everything that Jesus did. And so they said, we're going to decide to take up the task of writing down some of the things that Jesus said and some of the things that Jesus did, so that those of us who are alive centuries later, hundreds or thousands of years later, would be able to have a firsthand experience. So today, we get to take a look at what Jesus had to say about gentleness. It's like we're looking at an eyewitness report, and we're going to go to the very middle of the most famous sermon that Jesus ever preached. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus has just gotten started preaching this sermon, and he gets to the very end of Matthew chapter 5, and that's where we're going to join him. And I think Jesus, in this chapter, in this passage, is going to help us learn how to be gentle and how to respond in this way and what that looks like. So in Matthew chapter 5, beginning with verse 38, it says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth." Now, I don't know about you, but I love that, right? If you attack me, I'm going to get you back. You do something to me, I'm going to get you, right? Fair play. But then he goes on. Verse 39, "But I tell you, do not resist an evil person." And we're going to stop right there. Do not resist an evil person. And it's kind of like, come on, Jesus. Really? An evil person? I mean, does that mean that if somebody comes up and tries to mug us, if somebody comes up and tries to hurt our family, that we shouldn't resist them, that we shouldn't attack them? We see the original word for the word resist doesn't mean take whatever you want. You know, take my wallet, take my kids, take my spouse, whatever you want. No, the word for resist means to stand in opposition to. So it's very different. It doesn't mean defend. It means to stand in opposition to. And Jesus is literally saying, when the time comes when somebody is standing in opposition to you, don't you stand in opposition to them. That's not what my followers do. My followers choose to relinquish their right to get even. You see, I don't know if you know this, but for those of you who identify as Christian, I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is you get to spend eternity with God. Yay! Here's the bad news. When you decided to follow Jesus, you gave up your right to be unloving. You gave up your right to seek revenge. You gave up your right to throw spears at other people who are rude to you, who cut you off in traffic, who spread lies about you. You gave up your right to do that. And that's why I say, I mean, there are going to be verses in this passage that if Jesus came down from heaven right now and said, I'm going to give you an infallible erase like 3 or 4 verses, that's one of them. So I'm like, Jesus, I want that right, to be able to react when somebody comes at me, and yet Jesus isn't done. He goes on here. He says, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. And again, I think to myself, those are 3 tough illustrations right there. If somebody slaps me on the cheek, Jesus is saying, turn them the other one as well. But that's really not what he's saying. He's saying, if somebody slaps you on the cheek, what he's saying, that's literally an idiom, a metaphor. He says, offer them the relationship, even if they slap you on the cheek. If somebody ends up taking your coat, go the extra mile, give them your tunic as well. And literally, people would be laughing when Jesus said this. You know why? Because in the first century, it was a 2-garment society. So Jesus is saying, what lengths are you willing to go to for the sake of peace? I want you to go the lengths of being naked. And I guarantee you, we don't laugh here because we live in a 16-garment society, right? But back then, people would have kind of laughed. And then he says, if somebody forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. And literally, in the first century, a Roman soldier had the right to ask anyone in the land that they were occupying to take their heavy pack and carry it a mile for them. So you could be walking on your way doing something, and they could stop you and say, citizen, take my pack and carry it a mile. And you would have to put on hold whatever you were doing and follow that Roman soldier with their pack for a mile. And Jesus is saying, you know that those people who are brutal, that occupying Roman force, I want you to take their pack an extra mile. There's this Christian leader who lives in Atlanta named Reggie Joyner, and Reggie Joyner once said, the first mile is about obligation. The second mile is about establishing a relationship. And I think to myself, wow, that's way beyond me, because if there was an occupying force in this country and they asked me to carry their pack for a mile, I'd be hard-pressed to do that. But then you ask me to carry it for another mile, and Jesus is saying, yes, if you want to be my follower, that should be your attitude, even to the most brutal people in society. And he finishes off here in verse 42. He says, give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. And you would think that that would be it. But Jesus goes on. And if you thought that was hard, wait till the next one. He says in verse 43, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Yeah, I can be pretty good at that. But then he says, I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Because everybody would have been hanging on what he said about going an extra mile, and everybody would have realized that he was talking about the Roman soldiers of the day. These people were brutal. These people came in and they took the land of Palestine that did not belong to them. They were an occupying force led by a dictator who thought that he was God, or a god, thought that he was divine. And literally, these Roman soldiers would crucify their fellow countrymen. So when you saw somebody, there's a good chance that that person, that Roman soldier probably killed a friend of yours or a family member. And Jesus is saying, I don't want you to attack. I want you to love, and I want you to pray for those who persecute you. I want you to give up the right to get even. And you're like, I don't know about following this Jesus thing. Isn't there a more militant way? Because everybody in that first century was expecting the Messiah to come and to be this militant Messiah who would overthrow the Roman government and establish his kingdom right there in that time. And Jesus says, no, one day at the end of the world, I will come in force, but today I'm coming in peace, and I want you to reflect that attitude, that attribute. Really what he's describing here is gentleness. You probably have every right to respond and to attack, but I want you to surrender that right. You don't get to do that anymore if you're my follower. You lose the right to treat people poorly, even those who stand in opposition to you. And he goes on, he says, so that, here's the reason, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. If you want to be known as a child of God, you treat people well. You choose to be gentle. You choose to harness the strength and the influence and the power that you have to attack another person, regardless of what they say about you, regardless of what they did or didn't invite you to, regardless of what they've done to you in the past. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't put distance between you and other people, because sometimes you got to do that. And that doesn't mean that you don't have conversations and you don't have real, authentic, transparent conversations where you tell a person, yeah, that really hurt me. But Jesus is saying you do not have the right to strike back. If you want to be a child of your Father in heaven, that's not what it looks like. And he goes on, he says, why can we do this? Because God causes his sun to rise on the righteous and the unrighteous. This is what we call in fancy theological terminology as the doctrine of common grace. I mean, God gives everybody air, water, and earth to live in. He gives us all the same thing. If we follow him, we get salvation on top of that. We get an eternal relationship with him. But yet at the same time, God has everything worked out. He causes his sun to rise on the righteous and the unrighteous. If he has everything worked out, if he's in power and control, if he's not up in heaven pacing back and forth wondering, oh, I don't know what's going to happen in the world. I don't know what's going to happen in the next election. I don't know what's going to happen now that this big event has happened. God's not doing that. He is always sitting on his throne, executing his plan flawlessly. He causes his sun to rise on the righteous and the unrighteous. Jesus gives an even stronger challenge here in verse 46. He says, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Aren't even tax collectors doing that? And if you only greet your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? He's saying, if you only love those who love you, what reward will you get? Anybody can do that. You're no different than somebody who's not following God. And he says, this is the goal right here. Verse 48, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Love people, respond to people, be gracious towards people. Just like your Father would. Just like, if you follow Jesus, just like God did with you, right? God had every opportunity to throw the lightning bolt. But instead, he decided to send his son to die on the cross for your sins. So that when you believe in him, you can have an eternal relationship with your Father in heaven. God could have thrown the lightning bolt. Instead, he decided to send his son to die for your sins. Is it really that much for us to be gentle towards other people who may stand in opposition to us and other people that may not get it? But what do we do? Here's what I want you to do this week. I want you to respond graciously when you could react harshly. That's what I want you to do this week. I want you to respond graciously when you could react harshly. Now, this is difficult, but I think there's a real difference between responding graciously and reacting harshly. Because you might have every opportunity and every right, and you might have the cause, and you might have the power and the influence, and you might have the mouth, and you might have the intellect to be able to react harshly or coldly or passive-aggressively. But this week, when tough times come and when people treat you poorly, and people mistreat other people that you love, here's what I want you to do. I want you to respond graciously. That is not putting an okay stamp on what they've done, but that is showing that you are choosing to follow God instead of choosing to be just like everybody else in society. Let me give you an example of this, okay? I travel some, and my idea, if I don't believe in a purgatory, but if there was a purgatory, it would be LAX. I believe that with all my heart. And I've asked God for two things in my life I pray for on a regular basis. I say, Lord, help me never to have a kidney stone, and do not let me die at LAX. Those are the two things that I would be I'd be grateful if God would not allow to happen. And so when my wife and I first got married, she didn't realize, I don't mind flying, but she didn't realize that when I got to the airport, I was just a big ball of just focused intensity and everything. Now I have TSA pre-check, and it's like, wow, everything is right with the world. But back then, when they didn't have it, I mean, I'm thinking, okay, we got to get there 2 or 3 hours ahead of time, and we got to go stand in line. And then when we stand in line, we got to make sure and have a happy look on our face so we don't get pulled to the side by TSA, because then they're going to pat us down, and we run all of our luggage through, and then they're going to want us to pull everything out and look at everything, and then we zip everything up, and we won't have enough time to go get a Starbucks or a coffee or whatever. We go to get on the plane, and all of a sudden these people who are never in line magically appear on the plane, and they just take all the best seats. And Amy's like, you are really stressing me out. And so when we were first married, we went to go visit my parents who were living in Missouri at the time. We came back and, got through security, did everything else. I got, to our car at the parking spot on Century Boulevard, and I'm thinking all is right with the world. I feel like I'm in control again. I go through the parking spot. I hand the lady my debit card, pay for it. We're heading out, driving down Century Boulevard to the 405, and all of a sudden I look at Amy. I'm like, she still has my debit card. And I'm thinking to myself, she's like going to call China. She's going to schedule a trip, a cruise, something like that. She's going to take advantage of it. And I did the most illegal U-turn you have ever seen in your life on Century Boulevard. And I'm heading back to the parking spot, and I'm just like, Amy, she did that on purpose. I know it, and she's like, Caleb, maybe it's just a mistake. I said, this is cold-blooded debit card theft, okay? I guarantee you, it happens at the parking spot all the time. Just all the time. And so I'm just in line, and I'm just like thinking to myself, I'm just going to let this lady have it. And Amy's like, maybe it was a mistake. I'm like, no, it's no mistake. She's like, well, Caleb, what if she's a Christian? I'm like, Christians don't steal debit cards, okay? Come on, there's no way. And I'm getting ready to react to her, and Amy's like, will you calm down? I'm like, no, she needs to understand. I pull right up, and she looks at me, recognizes me, and says, well, praise Jesus. I knew you'd come back. I was just praying for you. And I'm looking at her, and I'm just like literally jaw open. I'm like, and she's like, thank you for coming back. I could see you were such a nice Christian man. I saw the nice little Christian fish on your back window here, and, here's your card, and may the Lord richly bless your day. And I'm driving away. And you would think that wasn't the worst part of it. The worst part of it was my wife's glare. Husbands, you know what I'm talking about? It's like I could feel it. And I could just feel her looking at me, and I didn't even look at her. I just said, I'm not in a place where I want to talk about this right now. You see, we miss out on a lot when we choose to react harshly instead of responding graciously. And what I want you to do this week is I want you to respond with grace and love and kindness. Doesn't mean you don't distance yourself. You can do that. It doesn't mean that you don't have difficult conversations. If you need to have those, you can do that. But it means that you choose to be gentle. You choose to harness your strength, and you choose to respond with grace and love instead of harshness. Respond graciously when you could react harshly. How do we do this? There are two things that I think we can do. First one is remember God has all power, and surrender your emotions to God. This is really what Jesus is saying. He says, remember that God has all power, that God has all authority, that he is the most powerful being in existence. Nothing goes unseen to him because God is everywhere at once. Jesus says, hey, he causes the sun to rise on both the righteous and the unrighteous. And if you believe God has that kind of power, don't you believe that whatever happened to you, God has the power to deal with? And don't you believe that God probably knows that person's heart better than you? And aren't there times when you responded to people and you reacted harshly and you knew it afterwards and you felt your heart sink and you didn't get a chance to be able to talk to that person, but you had a whole bunch of things going on in your life that was influencing your reaction at that time? Maybe we should apply the same rule of thought to other people if we want to be gentle, if we really want to do this. And also, I think we need to surrender our emotions to God. Because here's the deal. You can't control your first emotion that wells up inside of you. But studies show you can choose to control your second, your third, your fourth, your fifth reaction and emotion. You see, here's a great thing. It's good and bad. But God has never held me responsible for the actions of someone else. He's never held me accountable for what someone else has done. That's the reason why Jesus says, if you only love those who love you, what reward will you get? There's a reason why Paul says in Romans 12:18, as much as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. So both Jesus and Paul says that love and peace with other people depend on me, not them. If you want to respond graciously when you could react harshly, remember that God has all the power. Surrender your emotions to God. And here's the very last thing I want to say. Jesus said something super, super cool about gentleness. But the NIV, usually the ESV, the NLT, whatever translation you have, it doesn't always translate this word as gentleness, even though it's the same word. In the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, what we just read in Matthew 5:5, here's what Jesus says. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the gentle. Jesus says, if you are in a place where you choose to harness your reactions, surrender your emotions, trust in the authority of God, and respond gently to those who mistreat you, when you could react harshly, Jesus says, you will receive an inheritance with God. Surrender your authority today to get authority tomorrow with Jesus in the next world. That's what I want you to do this week. I told you, it's not my favorite subject, but it's something that really reveals your maturity in your relationship with Jesus. Make the choice. Respond graciously when you could react harshly. Let me pray for you. Lord, thank you so much for these people. Thank you for our time that we have together. And I pray, Lord, as we get ready to move on with the rest of our days, that we would be people who would respond in graciousness and kindness. And I pray that if there are people here that have been turned off by Christians in the past, that are struggling, that they would look to you. And maybe today would be the start for some first steps towards you that they could make. I love you, Lord. It's in your Son's name I pray. Amen.